The first time I saw him, he was sitting in the back of his cage like a prisoner who'd given up on parole. Rain tapped against the shelter's windows like impatient fingers, the kind of steady, gray drizzle that made the whole world feel muffled. I pulled my damp coat tighter around myself as I stepped inside, the scent of bleach and wet fur hitting me like a wall. The Willowbrook Animal Shelter wasn't a sad place, not exactly, but it had that quiet heaviness of lives on pause. I hadn't planned on coming here. 3 months ago, I'd lost Miso, a tiny, loud-mouthed Siamese who'd been my shadow for 14 years. She'd died in her sleep, curled in the crook of my arm like she always did, and I'd woken up to her stillness. The vet called it peaceful, but there's nothing peaceful about the way grief carves you out. So no, I wasn't here to adopt. I was here because my therapist had suggested it. Sometimes, she'd said, the only way past loss is to remember what love feels like. The shelter was warm at least. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed, flickering just enough to be noticeable. A volunteer, a woman in her 50s with a name tag reading Diane, smiled at me from behind the front desk. "Looking for anyone special?" she asked. I shook my head. "Just looking." She nodded like she understood, and maybe she did. I wandered past the dogs first, a chorus of hopeful barks and wagging tails, before turning into the cat room. It was quieter here, just the rustle of paws on newspaper and the occasional soft thump of a toy being batted across a cage. And then, I saw him. A massive, scarred-up tabby with a torn ear and a tail that looked like it had seen too many fights. He wasn't pacing, wasn't meowing, just sitting in the back of his cage like he'd long since stopped expecting anything. But his eyes, gold, with pupils like black blades, locked onto mine the second I stepped closer. I crouched down, elbows on my knees. "Hey, big guy." He didn't blink, didn't move, just watched me with a stare that felt like being assessed. Diane appeared beside me, following my gaze. "Ah, that's Gus. How long's he been here?" 8 months, she said. "Longest resident we've got." I frowned. "Why?" She sighed. "He's not easy. Doesn't like being touched. Hisses if you move too fast. We think he was on the streets for a long time before someone brought him in." I reached a finger toward the bars, slow. Gus's tail twitched once, but he didn't retreat. And then, so subtle I almost missed it, he leaned forward, just a fraction, just enough that his nose nearly grazed the metal. I held my breath. Diane chuckled. "Huh, he never does that." I pulled my hand back, suddenly aware of my own heartbeat. Gus let out a sound, not a meow, not a growl, but something in between, a low, questioning murmur. I stood up too fast, my knees cracking. "I should go." Diane nodded, but her eyes were knowing. "He's not for everyone." I turned to leave, my throat tight. Behind me, Gus made that sound again. I didn't look back. But that night, lying in bed, all I could see were those gold eyes, watching me like he knew something I didn't. I hadn't come to the shelter to adopt a cat. But for the first time in months, I didn't feel quite so alone. I told myself I was just visiting, but by the 3rd day, I was bringing treats. The shelter's automatic doors hissed shut behind me as I stepped inside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. My hands were shoved deep in my pockets, fingers curled around the small bag of salmon-flavored treats I'd picked up from the pet store on a whim. Just to see, I told myself. Not because I'm actually considering this. Diane looked up from the front desk, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. A slow smile spread across her face when she saw me. "Back so soon?" I shrugged, trying to sound casual. "Had some free time." The truth was, I hadn't stopped thinking about Gus, about the way he'd watched me with those unblinking golden eyes, like he was waiting for me to prove something. The cat room was quieter today, the usual rustling of paws and occasional meows softened by the golden hour light filtering through the windows. Gus was in his usual spot at the back of his cage, but this time, his head lifted slightly when I approached. I crouched down, pulling the treats from my pocket with exaggerated slowness. The crinkling of the bag made his ears twitch. "Hey, tough guy," I murmured, shaking a few treats into my palm. "Brought you something." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with deliberate caution, Gus uncurled himself and took a single step forward. His movements were precise, calculated, like every muscle was ready to spring back at the first sign of threat. I held my breath as he stretched his neck forward, his nose quivering as he sniffed at the treats in my hand. His whiskers brushed my skin, light as feathers, and then, quick as a strike, he snatched one and retreated to the back of the cage, crunching loudly. I couldn't help but laugh. "Yeah, okay, no trust yet, I get it." Over the next week, I came back every day, sometimes with treats, sometimes just to sit near his cage and talk. I told him about Miso, about how she used to steal my socks and pile them in the bathroom sink, about how the apartment felt too quiet now, the silence pressing in like a physical weight. Gus never responded, but he listened, head tilted slightly, ears swiveling toward my voice. Then, on the 8th day, something changed. I was mid-sentence, rambling about my terrible attempt at baking banana bread, when Gus did something he'd never done before. He flopped onto his side, exposing his belly in a slow, deliberate stretch. I froze. Diane, who'd been restocking supplies nearby, let out a soft gasp. "Well, I'll be damned. Is that good?" I whispered, afraid to move. She nodded, grinning. "For Gus? That's basically a marriage proposal." Carefully, so carefully, I reached a hand toward the bars. Gus watched me, his tail flicking once, twice. But he didn't tense, didn't retreat. My fingers slipped between the metal, hovering just above his fur. "Can I?" He exhaled loudly through his nose, as if annoyed by my hesitation, and butted his head against my hand. The moment my fingers made contact, something inside me cracked open. His fur was softer than I expected, warm and thick beneath my palm. A deep, rumbling purr started up in his chest, vibrating through my fingertips like a live wire. I didn't realize I was crying until a tear splashed onto the floor between us. Diane tactfully busied herself across the room as I scrubbed at my face with my sleeve. Gus, for his part, seemed entirely unfazed by my breakdown. He just kept purring, kneading the blanket beneath him with his massive paws, eyes half-lidded in contentment. It hit me then, with sudden, painful clarity. This wasn't just about me trying to heal. It was about him, too. About the way he'd been waiting here all these months, judged too broken to love. I sniffed, scratching gently behind his torn ear. "Yeah, okay, you win." When I looked up, Diane was already holding out the adoption paperwork, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Took you long enough," she said. Gus yawned, stretching out his full length as if to say, "About damn time." The adoption papers were signed, but Gus never acted like he belonged to me. The first night in my apartment, Gus disappeared. I'd set him up with everything: a plush bed by the radiator, fresh water in a ceramic bowl, even the expensive grain-free food Diane had recommended. But the moment I opened the carrier, he was gone in a streak of tabby fur, vanishing into the shadows beneath my couch like smoke. I crouched on the floor, peering into the darkness. "Gus?" Silence, I told myself it was normal, that he needed time. But as the hours ticked by, no movement, no sound, an old, familiar dread curled in my stomach. What if I've made a mistake? At 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of something shattering in the kitchen. I bolted upright, heart hammering. The apartment was pitch black, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. Then, a low, guttural growl. "Gus!" I whispered, fumbling for my phone's flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the wreckage of my favorite mug, a thrift store find, chipped but beloved, now in pieces on the tile. And there, perched on the counter like some ancient, disgruntled deity, was Gus. His fur was puffed out, his tail thrashing. His golden eyes were fixed not on me, but on the space above my refrigerator. A cockroach. Not just any cockroach, a monster of a thing, antennae twitching as it scuttled along the cabinet. Before I could react, Gus launched himself through the air with a yowl that sounded more lion than house cat. He hit the fridge with a thud, claws scrabbling against the stainless steel as the roach darted away. "Jesus Christ!" I stumbled back as Gus ricocheted off the appliance, landing in a crouch before tearing after the insect. What followed was the most chaotic 10 minutes of my life. Gus became a blur of teeth and fury, knocking over a fruit bowl, upending the trash can, and, in a move that defied physics, somehow scaling the curtains. The roach, to its credit, put up a valiant fight, zigzagging across the walls with Gus in hot pursuit. Then, silence. Panting, I flicked on the overhead light. Gus sat regally in the center of the wreckage, the roach clamped between his jaws. He gave me a look that was almost smug before trotting past me, dropping his prize at my feet like some grotesque offering. I stared at it, then at him. He licked his paw, utterly pleased with himself. I burst out laughing. It was the first real laugh I'd had in months, the kind that left me wheezing, tears streaming down my face. Gus watched me, head tilted, as if trying to decide whether I'd lost my mind. "You," I gasped, wiping my eyes, "are a menace." He blinked slowly, then butted his head against my shin. That was the moment I realized Gus wasn't just a cat. He was a force of nature. Over the next few weeks, he carved out his place in my life with the subtlety of a wrecking ball. He refused to sleep in the bed I bought him, preferring instead to sprawl across my chest at night, his weight both suffocating and comforting. He developed an obsession with my shower, sitting on the mat to yowl at the water like it had personally offended him. And then there were the gifts. Dead mice, half-alive moths. Once, a single, pristine maple leaf he dragged in from God knows where. Each offering left deliberately in my slippers, because of course, he'd learned where I kept them. But for all his quirks, Gus had rules. He didn't like being picked up, didn't tolerate kisses, and if I pet him for even a second too long, he'd deliver a warning bite. Never hard enough to break skin, but enough to say, "That's enough." I respected his boundaries, mostly. Then, one rainy Tuesday, everything changed. I'd just gotten home from work, soaked from the downpour, when I noticed it, the smell. Smoke. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but as I stepped further into the apartment, the scent grew stronger, acrid, and wrong. "Gus!" I called, dropping my bag. No answer. Then, a crash from the bedroom. I ran. The scene hit me like a punch, flames licking up the side of my nightstand, sparked by a faulty outlet I'd been meaning to replace. And there, in the middle of it all, was Gus. He was yowling, batting at something on the bed, my phone. The phone I'd left charging under my pillow like an idiot. "Gus, no!" I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the hallway, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the pin. The flames were spreading, smoke thickening the air. A sharp pain bit into my ankle. Gus. He'd sunk his teeth into me, hard, his pupils blown wide with panic. Then he let go and bolted for the door, stopping only to look back at me with a scream that sounded almost human. "Follow." I did. We made it out just as the smoke detector finally wailed to life. Sirens echoed in the distance as I collapsed on the sidewalk. Gus pressed tight against my side, his entire body trembling. I coughed, my lungs burning, and pulled him closer. He didn't bite me. He didn't pull away. He just leaned into my touch, his purr a ragged, broken thing as the fire trucks rounded the corner. In that moment, I understood. Gus had never needed me to save him, but tonight, he'd saved me. The firemen called him a hero, but when the cameras left, Gus still wouldn't let me hold him. The acrid smell of smoke clung to our skin as we sat on the curb outside my burning apartment building. Firefighters shouted over the hiss of hoses, their floodlights painting the scene in stark, unnatural white. Someone had draped a foil blanket over my shoulders. For shock, they said, but I barely felt it. My entire world had narrowed to two things: the crackling roar of the flames and the warm, trembling weight of Gus pressed against my side. A paramedic knelt beside me, shining a penlight in my eyes. "You're lucky," she said. "Another few minutes and—" Her words dissolved into static. Lucky. The word rattled around my skull. I didn't feel lucky. I felt hollowed out, scraped raw. Everything I owned, Miso's favorite blanket, the photo albums, the thrifted coffee mug Gus had shattered during his roach hunt, was turning to ash behind me. Gus sneezed. The sound, so ordinary amidst the chaos, snapped me back. I looked down at him. His whiskers were singed at the tips, his fur matted with soot, but his eyes, those impossible golden eyes, were clear, alert, watching me. He butted his head against my ribs once, hard. Still here. The fire captain approached, his boots crunching on broken glass. "Miss, your cat. He's the one who alerted you?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The man shook his head, grinning. "Damn smart animal. You should get him a medal." A news crew arrived then, their camera lights blinding. They wanted the story, the heroic cat who'd saved his owner. They cooed over Gus, tried to pet him. He flattened his ears and hissed, slinking behind my legs. "Sorry," I murmured, shielding him with my body. He doesn't like strangers." The reporter frowned. "But he saved your life?" I stared at her. What did she want? For Gus to pose with a tiny fire helmet? To give some tearful interview about our unbreakable bond? The truth was messier. Because later, in the sterile motel room the Red Cross had arranged, Gus still wouldn't let me cradle him like the hero everyone claimed he was. When I reached for him, he ducked away, leaping onto the dresser with a fluid grace that said, "Boundaries remain." I sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. "You're impossible, you know that?" Gus licked a paw and dragged it over his ear, utterly unrepentant. But then, as I lay down, curling into myself, the mattress dipped behind me. Slowly, deliberately, Gus settled along the curve of my spine, his warmth seeping through the thin motel blankets. Not cuddling, not purring, just there. It was the closest he'd ever come to holding me. I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of retching. "Gus?" The bathroom light revealed him hunched over the tile, coughing up a foamy, yellowish mess. My stomach dropped. Hey! I crouched beside him, hands hovering. "What's wrong?" He tried to slink away but stumbled. That's when I saw it. The way his breaths came too quick, too shallow. The glassy sheen to his eyes. Smoke inhalation. The emergency vet's waiting room smelled like antiseptic and fear. Gus huddled in his carrier, silent except for the occasional wet cough. Every rasp tore at me. "You're okay," I whispered, pressing my fingers to the grate. "You're gonna be okay." He didn't look at me. The diagnosis came back grim. Chemical pneumonitis. The vet, a tired-eyed woman with a stethoscope around her neck, laid out the options. Oxygen therapy. IV fluids. Possibly a feeding tube. "Well, how in the cost?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Her pause said everything. I signed the paperwork. For 3 days, I slept in hospital chairs, my neck stiff, my clothes sour with sweat. Gus lay in his oxygen cage, his sides rising and falling too fast. Sometimes, when the nurses weren't looking, I'd press my palm to the glass. On the 4th morning, the vet smiled. "He's turning a corner." And there, in the cage, Gus lifted his head. Weakly, but unmistakably, he bumped his nose against the glass where my hand rested. Still here. They discharged him with a list of instructions and a warning. "He'll need quiet. No stress." As if. Back in our new temporary apartment, a friend's cousin's place, loaned out of pity, Gus immediately vanished under the bed. I let him be. Instead, I set up his food, his water, the softest blanket I could find. Then I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and waited. An hour passed. Then, the slightest rustle. Gus emerged like a shadow given form. He looked thinner, his movements careful. But his eyes, God, his eyes, were the same. That unblinking gold, watching, always watching. He approached in slow increments. Pause, sniff, step, repeat. When he finally reached me, he didn't climb into my lap. Didn't purr, just leaned. His entire weight pressed against my thigh, his head drooping until his forehead touched my knee. Exhausted, alive, mine, except that was the thing, wasn't it? Gus had never been mine. Not really. He wasn't a pet, wasn't some docile creature to be owned. He was a battle-scarred, half-wild thing who'd chosen, against all odds, to let me into his world, to save me, and maybe that was better. My fingers hovered above his back. "Can I?" A long beat, then the barest flick of his tail. Permission granted. I touched him gently, tracing the ridge of his spine. His fur was coarse in places, still carrying the faint scent of smoke. Beneath my palm, his heartbeat thrummed. Steady, stubborn, alive. Outside, the first birds of dawn began to sing. Gus sighed, his whole body melting into the contact. And for the first time since the fire, I breathed easy. 3 years later, I still find orange fur in my coffee. The morning sun slants through our kitchen window, painting the floor in warm stripes. Our kitchen, because the apartment is his as much as mine now. I scoop coffee grounds into the French press, yawning when something brushes against my bare ankle. Gus. He winds figure eights between my legs, his tail flicking against my calf with the precision of a metronome. No longer the gaunt shelter cat, but a barrel-chested bruiser with a coat like polished amber. His torn ear twitches as I pour hot water, sending steam curling toward the ceiling. "You're blocking the fridge," I tell him. He blinks up at me, unimpressed, and plops down directly in front of the refrigerator door. Some things never change. The scars remain, both the visible and invisible ones. My rebuilt apartment still smells faintly of fresh paint on stormy days. Gus still coughs sometimes, a wet, rattling sound that sends me bolting upright in bed before he glares at me like I'm overreacting. We've settled into our damage together. I find his fur everywhere, stuck to my black work slacks, floating in my soup. Once, memorably, woven into the yarn of a scarf I knitted for my mother. "Is this some new avant-garde fiber art?" she'd asked. Every strand a reminder. I was here. I am here. He never became a lap cat, never learned to tolerate being picked up. But now, when I cry, which still happens because grief isn't linear, he presses his forehead to my shin and stays there until my breathing evens out. When I brought home a date last month, Gus stared at the poor man for 5 silent minutes before deliberately knocking his beer onto the carpet. "He's intense," the guy had said, mopping at his jeans. "We didn't go out again?" This morning, as I sip my coffee, fur-free miraculously, Gus leaps onto the counter with a thud. He knows he's not allowed up here, knows I'll scold him, but he does it anyway because rules are for lesser creatures. I raise an eyebrow. "Really?" He licks his paw, feigning nonchalance, then nudges my wrist with his nose. Not quite an apology, more of a, "You'll forgive me." And I do, because here's the truth no one tells you about rescue animals. You don't save them, not really. They save you right back, in their own stubborn, infuriating ways. Gus didn't teach me to love again. Miso had already done that. What Gus taught me was how to be loved differently. Not in the easy, purring bundle of fur way of storybooks, but in the real, messy way that demands patience. The kind of love that leaves scars and chewed up shoelaces and tiny, hard-won victories. Like right now, as he butts his head against my elbow, purring loud enough to rattle the dishes. "Fine," I mutter, scratching behind his ragged ear. "You win." Outside, the wind chimes I hung last summer, and Gus immediately tried to murder, sing softly. The neighbor's dog barks. A siren wails in the distance. Gus's ears swivel toward the sound, but he doesn't flinch. Doesn't hide, just leans harder into my hand, his golden eyes slitting against the sunlight. I used to think I'd adopted him. Now I know better. Some bonds aren't about ownership. They're about two broken creatures choosing, day after day, to curl their jagged edges together until they fit. The coffee's gone cold. I don't mind.